welcome to PGurus channel. I'm your host Sri Iyer. Today, Indu Viswanathan is back with us. You all will remember that Indu and Nikun Trivedi had participated, along with Parihar, had participated in a hangout with us a few weeks ago. And Indu is pursuing a PhD in the Teachers College at Columbia University. She has been in the field of education for 20 plus years. Indu, welcome to PGurus channel.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back.
So, Indu, one of the things that I read from your post was about Facebook avatars. And when the West starts using Sanskrit words, avatar, karma, and kismet, kismet is not a Sanskrit word, avatar, karma, and so on, sometimes they don't quite use it in the right context. In your opinion, Facebook used avatar in a way that kind of offended you, isn't it? What did you think about it?
Sure. I wouldn't say that it offended me. I would say it more struck me that they were using this term avatar. And we know the term avatar has been used for about 30 years in the gaming community for expression, personal expression, and sort of exploring identities. And so I thought, the teacher hat was on. And I was like, everyone is online right now playing with avatars. This is an opportunity to teach what this term actually means. I'm not sure how many people even know that it has a Sanskrit or an origin someplace outside of the gaming community, because I've heard people use it. Of course, they don't say avatar. Of course, they say avatar. And so even just the pronunciation of the term and the origin of the term. And I think what's interesting, and you kind of hit upon it, is that when people talk about cultural appropriation and whether or not that's a slippery slope and if that's even helpful. But what strikes me, again, as an educator, is that when a term is lifted off of one epistemology, off of one knowledge tradition, and then sort of parachuted into another one, it picks up the meaning of the new epistemology, and that's what kind of contorts the meaning, right? Because in a single life paradigm, when you're exploring your avatar, it's just about self-expression. In a multiple life paradigm, avatar has a completely different meaning, right?
You wrote about this in a Medium post, and looks like there were a lot of inputs on that. What was the experience of people? What did you hear from the community?
So actually what happened was, first I wrote a Facebook post about it. And there was a lot of positive feedback and a lot of people actually saying, wow, I actually, it was kind of overwhelming how much positive feedback there was. It was picked up through educator friends of mine. It actually made it onto some Facebook groups that are comprised of educators who were interested in things like multiculturalism and things like that.
Right.
And then I saw, because I made the unfortunate move of chasing down some of the shares, I saw that it had been shared on a couple of places where it wasn't taken in the spirit of learning, and it was sort of imposed in this wokeness paradigm. And I was immediately cast as this Savarna, unconscious, Brahminical, privileged, whatnot, with all sorts of fascinating accusations made by fascinating ways of thinking about it and fascinating people. I use the term fascinating, obviously, with a wink. And so then I wrote a fuller Medium piece about it, kind of because I thought it was interesting data, and of course, data is the way that I distance myself from some of these experiences that can be very painful. But I decided to deconstruct it a little bit. So I took up those shares in the commentary, and I turned that into kind of like data analysis to understand what had happened, because I genuinely had not even approached from a perspective of being offended by this usage, but more like, hey, here's a teachable moment. And it seemed like I wasn't even permitted to do that. And I found that to be really interesting.
Well, that sort of takes us to the next question. I keep reading wokeness, and so on and so forth. And I think of woke as someone who woke up from sleep or something like that. But this word now has a new connotation, isn't it? Perhaps for the viewers who are curious about it, can you share what your thoughts on when somebody says wokeness or uses woke in a sentence? What exactly is today's generation meaning?
So I'll give a little bit of the origin story, which I do talk about in my article. So it started off in music, actually, in African American music in the earlier part of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really about staying alert to the fact that while enslavement had gone away, that there was still a lot of systemic oppression of Black folk. And so it was a matter of staying alert. So it was stay alert because these things are still happening. And it was sort of a way of connecting across the Black community in that way. And it experienced a revival in the early 21st century, again, through music. And then after, I think it was Trayvon Martin or one of the other shootings of an African-American person, it started to pick up speed in what had become social justice spaces. And of course, now we were in the age of the internet and social media. And so all of these things just gained traction a lot faster. And I would say in parallel with that is this tendency for pop culture to pick up things from Black culture, again, cultural appropriation, and sort of have it take on its own meaning. So for better or for worse, and I mean that very intentionally, wokeness became something outside of just the African-American signaling of, hey, there are things still happening, we need to be alert to this, to a sign of someone. Now wokeness became an identity almost, like I am a woke person, that was like, hey, I'm aware that there's more to the systems than we're kind of talking about, and I'm here to talk about it. And then from there, it kind of became more and more and more and more extreme from just being alert to, I know more than you do. And there are certain rules and there are certain ways of deconstructing all of this. And if you don't follow this specific vernacular and this specific interpretation that seems to be, it's almost like it started off with the Black community in music, it expanded to the Black community at large, it expanded to social justice, or anyone who was sort of wanted to be committed to staying alert and understanding what was happening beneath the scenes or beneath the facade, to actually this very small group of people are going to define what it is. And if you're not with the program, and if you don't use the vernacular in a very particular way, then you're canceled or you're out, or you're worse, you're a part of the problem. You're who we're fighting against. And so it's interesting, right? Because as you said, I've been in education for 20 years, and the program that I graduated from is the program that I teach in now, that I'm getting my doctorate in. And it is, you know, dedicated to social justice. And I've noticed the shift, right, in the 20 years. So my fourth day of student teaching was 9/11. I was in the classroom on the Upper East Side teaching. And there was a marked shift, right? Because then it became about so many more communities and so many more groups became, what's the term? Like circumscribed within this idea of wokeness and social justice. And then you had the onset of social media. So in the 20 years that I've been in this social justice education space, I found myself having a very different relationship with it, because I've seen that it's gone from, hey, let's include more people into this conversation about who deserves what kind of rights, into something that's almost more exclusionary, and going away from that central meaning of like, let's be alert to what's happening, and more like you're alert or you're not alert, and therefore you're a good or a bad person. And it's become very almost judgmental based on whether or not you know that lingo.
Yes, and thanks for clarifying that for us. You know, I've lived in the United States for many, many years, but somehow some of these nuances escape me. I mean, it's like the people that you move with, right? And I'm a startup person, and startups tend to have very few employees. Anyway, I'm not making excuses here. I'm not woke enough. So that's all I can say. Now, Indu, you've been following and tracking the Black Lives Matter movement. It took a life of its own. I mean, what started out as an outrage against the killing of a Black man then took a life of its own. You had these things like CHAZ, which also renamed itself as CHOP in Seattle. And then people started pulling down statues and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, in this brouhaha, Mahatma Gandhi's name also got involved. In fact, there is a city resolution being considered in the city of Leicester in United Kingdom, where they're debating whether to pull down Gandhi's statue. and a couple of reasons were given. I'm not going to go into all that stuff. Viewers know all about it because I've dealt with it in a different video. To you, you are an educator. You are coming across a rainbow of children from various countries and various communities. What did it feel when this thing started somewhere? It has gone somewhere else. The net, upshot of all this is destruction of some people who probably had only their store as their savings, and now a terrific rise in COVID. And we don't know when this is going to again start getting under control. What are your thoughts on this?
It's interesting. I almost want to ask you some questions first before I get
Sure,
into my thoughts,
sure.
because I think there are different ways of narrating what's happening, and obviously no one narration of what's happening is complete or total.
Yes.
And the way you've described it is a way that I've heard it of what's happening described in certain circles, but it's not how I'm hearing it described in every circle that I'm a part of.
Mm-hmm.
So one, just the assumption that this is about what happened to one man, and that it's sort of spiraled from there, is based on the assumption that all of this is happening because of this one event, as opposed to it being a flashpoint event that happened because of so many other things that have happened for so long before. I guess the question I would ask for you is, what do you feel are the material and legitimate arguments being made that wouldn't necessarily explain violence or destruction, but would explain a call to reconsider the systems? Let's say that the violence against stores is a statement against material goods being valued over human life, right? Let's take it symbolically. What do you see in your experience of understanding or studying this? What do you see are the legitimate claims that maybe you don't agree with the way in which it's being handled, but you do understand the legitimate claims?
Well, first off, what I would say is that, when you fight with an ammunition that the other side cannot counter with, that's when you start winning. I mean, how did Martin Luther King become so successful in Black rights movement? It's not as if he was the first one, but he was the most successful one. And how he did that was to take the values that M.K. Gandhi put in India, and he applied it to the Black community in the United States. That's how the first levels of barriers were broken. I don't see Martin Luther King's marches being associated with destruction of property. You see, I'm making a very clear distinction here. And his thing was nonviolence, and that is what got the most amount of mileage for the suppressed community. And this is a work in progress. Already we know now that the Congress is passing a bill to have the entire system of law and order being looked at in a more holistic manner. I don't know what exactly are the parameters that they are going to define while they come up with a new set of rules. So that is a work in progress, and the Congress is acting. And my simple question or simple counter question to you is, I was really touched by one board that I saw in a strip mall. This says, "I'm a single mom, and this is all I have got. Please be considerate." If you are that single mom, then just think about it. There is this mob coming, and they're going after every street, every store, and there is no way of recovering these things, because sometimes people who have these one small, cubbyhole store don't even get insurance for that. And therefore, whatever they have is all they have. If they don't move the goods, they don't get paid. So this is the kind of situation that had arisen out of this. And I just felt sad that, there is a genuine grouse. I'm all for that. But the expression of that is all I'm concerned about.
Yeah, so a few things. One, I think a fallacy that's being made broadly is that this is all that Black Lives Matter is this exact tension or this interface that you're talking about, where you have people who are also experiencing some kind of disenfranchisement by society, who are coming up against these mobs that are coming to tear them down. That's not all that Black Lives Matter is, right? Black Lives Matter emerged through the artistic community, and it was a way of pulling people together in a really fascinating model of network leadership. So you don't have a single leader. And so because you don't have a single leader, you don't have a single person like MLK sort of calling the shots. That's not to say that there is not an ethos or something that grounds the movement, but it is very local. So first I would sort of push against this notion that all that Black Lives Matter is in its current iteration are mobs coming to attack the owners of
I didn't say that. I didn't say that.
I'm not saying that you are, but that seems to be the thread that everyone is pulling to argue against Black Lives Matter. So I just want to say first, there's so much more to it. You know, I'm sitting in Brooklyn. I'm streets away from where a lot of protests are happening, and they very much are peaceful protests. And actually, one of my good friends is summering at her mother-in-law, or they evacuated the city actually when schools became remote because they have too many children in a small apartment, and they got to stay in her mother-in-law's apartment. And she took her children, her young children, to some of these protests, and she noticed that in the more Black neighborhoods when they went to one protest, the place was surrounded by cops, even though the protest itself was peaceful. And she said her children, who are 6th graders, could feel the tension and the sense of impending violence, even though the protesters themselves were not being violent. Because the bulk of protesters were Black, there were cops surrounding it. The next day, they went to another protest that was mostly white people, and she's white and her family is white. There were no cops, and it felt totally peaceful. So we have to understand that there's a history to which protests get a lot of police presence, and what happens to the ethos of that protest, and what that leads to, and what that engenders, and what happens to other protests where there are, you know, and this happened to me when I went to the Women's March in DC in 2017. It was mostly not Black people, and there were barely any cops present, even though it was like hundreds of thousands of people. There were barely any cops present. It felt peaceful. And so I think we have to unpack some of these ideas we have, even the concept of a mob and who's in a riot and who's a protest. You can do a discourse analysis around how all of this is reported. And there are plenty of analyses about how these things are reported. When it's mostly people of a certain, who look a certain way, it's called a protest or a celebration. And when it's mostly people who look a different way, it's called a mob or a riot. And that gets sort of baked into our conceptualization of how these things are going about. The other thing I'll say is, you know, I was just talking to my father about this, and we were both noting that it takes a lot of, I don't like the term privilege, but I'll use it. It takes a lot of privilege to say, hey, you're scared that your child is going to get shot just for going outside and being Black, but really you should handle this a lot more peacefully. I mean, people are asking not to be killed for living in the skin that they're living in. That's how basic this is in terms of like Maslow's hierarchy. Like it's just survival. And we're saying, well, really, you really ought to go about this in a more peaceful way. And the truth is, in large part, people are going about it very peacefully. If you ask so many members of the Black Lives Matter movement, but don't all lives matter, their response is, of course, all lives matter. We want everyone to live, but we're just calling attention to this particular situation that's happening and that is not going away in our lives. And we're just calling attention to it. By contrast, you have a professor who has a Hindu name, I won't call her Hindu, who posts on Twitter, Brahmin lives don't matter and shouldn't matter. And white lives don't matter. And I don't think that the founders of Black Lives Matter or any of its network leadership would say white lives don't matter, white people should go away. I don't think that's the case at all. So you have all of these allies kind of pushing it to an extreme for their own agendas.
You know, if you had not told it, I would have thought that almost all protests were violent because that's all the TV was showing. And because of Corona, because of everyone, you know, everybody is, you know, quarantined, people are not going out. So there is a fake narrative. There is a hijacking of the narrative, if you will, in a certain direction. And thanks for clarifying that. And I did notice one thing that happened right very, very close to where I live, within a few miles. And this was on an interstate. They were actually trying to stop the traffic, and whoever was, gently trying to nudge and go out, they were beginning to use baseball bats to try and make them to stop. And these were not any one community color. Silicon Valley is the most melting. Perhaps it's a close second to New York. It's you get all sorts of shades. They just didn't want any traffic on an interstate, because stopping traffic would mean that you're going to cause some disruption somewhere. This is not violent. So it's just trying to force people to stop. Where it gets a little scary is that once you're stuck, I mean, if you have small children, they may want to go to the bathroom. What are you going to do about it? So these kinds of inconveniences, these are very common in India, in developing countries, because that's the only way you can get the attention of the government. I just was struck by that. I mean, that visual is still in my mind. But let's take the big picture on Indu. The point that we are all trying to make is, yes, systemic reforms are needed, and there is a debate going on that. But is this now going to wait for the outcome of that, or is it going to continue? In your opinion, where do you think these protests are?
I think the protests will fade simply because a lot of the people who are allies, there are some somewhat cynical commentaries I've read that I think actually have some merit, where they say, people were just looking for an excuse to get out of the house because everyone was housebound because of COVID. And now that cities are starting to open up and they can go to a restaurant instead of going to a protest, you're going to see a lot of people who are supposedly allies going to that. You are starting to see a lot of shift. You're starting to see people have a conversation, right? Like, this is bringing all of this to the forefront of conversation. The thing I would say is, this is a moment for people to really educate before we have an opinion. And yes, I have a bias towards that as an educator, as a teacher, but also as someone who continues to learn so much about this, that rather than be in a position where we're constantly saying, well, I read this article, what do you have to say for that? Almost like in this back and forth of gotchas. I think it's a good opportunity for us to really sit and really take in and learn some of these things. I'm finding a lot of people who say that they understand that this is systemic, don't necessarily understand how deeply and how insidiously this is working in systems. The other thing I'll say is that there's a lot of powerful work that comes behind this movement. If we look at Black Lives Matter as simply a representative of something larger, which is rich African-American studies that have been going on for decades with scholars and academics that are done with the highest level of rigor, I think there's a lot for all of us to learn from it, rather than just simply saying, well, it's violent, we don't agree with that, or that's not dharmic. I think there's a lot for the Hindu community to learn, for the Dharma community to learn from this movement, and from all of the work and research and everything that's gone behind it that supports it, rather than simply saying, well, I have a counter study, what do you have to say for that? I think if we could take a moment and actually really sit and learn, I think that there's a lot that could benefit everyone from this. One of the studies that I just read actually just came out of University of Chicago, and they did a study of the 20 police departments in the 20 biggest cities in the US. I don't know if you saw this study. And none of the departments meet even the basic universal human rights requirements, international human rights requirements, right? I mean, the fact that this study just came out and we're just hearing about it, I would say, like, probably we're listening a lot more deeply because these protests are happening around the country, and we have to give it credit for that.
Yes, indeed. And Corona has actually hit a reset button in our lives, if you will, because what we used to do, we can no longer do that. Even if you can go to the restaurants, right? There's much more of a physical separation. There's also, what you do, what you touch, and so on and so forth. And so it seems to me like this is a good time in history to try and, revisit many of these things and try to get them right. Not everything is going to be fixed, never, but at least the honest attempt has to be put in there. And I think one of the takeaways of Sanatana Dharma is, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is the world is but a small family. And in a family, we all get together, we understand each other, we try to get each other along and go. So the most important thing to me from that is that I'm a human being first, and everybody has a right to everything. I mean, and they also have duties and responsibilities to everything. So both need to coexist. Sometimes, I notice that the rights part is fairly well entrenched, but the responsibilities and the duties part, this is for a time for a different debate. I'd also like to talk to you about what do you think is going to happen now that SATs are becoming optional, and some other things that are doing the rounds in California in terms of how admissions are going to be determined in the California state university system. We'll do that in the next debate. Indu, my apologies for holding you up. I'm sorry for wasting your time for 15 minutes. I want to make that thing on record. This part will find it's in the final cut, because I really felt bad that I was running away with time. It was a 2-hour call with somebody, and I just didn't realize how much time I had spent on that. So thank you once again very much, Indu, and we'll be back with more such interesting. I think you have, given our viewers a totally new way to look at some of these things, which I think makes this channel all the more meaningful for me personally, because I want everyone to get that critical thinking skills, develop that skill. When your child comes home and says something, right, try to put yourself in the child's shoes and try to understand it. Makes for a much better conversation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Namaskaram.